In 2008, the king of the American highway announced it was leaving the road. For decades, the yellow Caterpillar engine block was the ultimate symbol of heavy-duty freight. The legendary 3406 and C15 engines powered the long hood Peterbilts and Kenworths that moved the country. But with the EPA's strict 2010 emission standards looming, Caterpillar made a choice that stunned the trucking industry. They would simply stop building on-highway truck engines for the North American market. Billions of dollars invested in clean diesel technology had reached a dead end. Fleet owners lost their most trusted option. Owner-operators lost a badge of independence. Truck stops lost the deep, mechanical idol that had defined American freight. The iron was not weak. The blocks could still run 1,000,000 miles before a rebuild. The paradox is that the yellow engine did not disappear because it failed the truck driver. It disappeared because it could no longer survive the rulebook. But the real story of the Caterpillar truck engine is not only the story of a corporate retreat, it is the story of how a machine that conquered the American highway lost the war against the exhaust pipe. Every week, we tell the stories of American engines, factories, machines, and industrial names that once taught the country what power sounded like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in the dirt of Peoria, Illinois, in the years following World War II. The story begins in the dirt of Peoria, Illinois, long before a yellow engine block was a common sight under the hood of an American highway truck. In the years following World War II, Caterpillar was an earth-moving empire. The company had built its reputation in farm fields, deep mines, and massive construction sites, producing the heavy track-type tractors that literally moved the American landscape. But the world was changing, and the country was about to pave a new kind of frontier. When the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 was signed, it launched the Interstate Highway System, initiating the largest public works project in American history. This new network of high-speed, cross-country concrete changed the fundamental math of freight. A truck was no longer just a local delivery vehicle moving goods between rail yards and warehouses. It was becoming a cross-country locomotive on rubber tires. But the engines of that era were struggling to keep up with the new demands. In the 1950s, many heavy trucks were still powered by large gasoline engines. A gasoline engine, an engine that uses spark ignition to burn a gasoline-air mixture, could be smooth and relatively inexpensive, but it was thirsty and lacked the deep pulling force required for maximum weight freight. Early diesel engines were making their way into fleets, but many were notoriously smoky, exceptionally loud, and often underpowered for the grueling climbs over the Rocky Mountains or the long, sustained runs across the Great Plains. America needed a new kind of power to pull loads that were steadily creeping toward 80,000 pounds. The market demanded massive torque, the twisting force of an engine felt by a truck driver as the sheer, unyielding pulling strength needed to drag a heavy trailer up a steep grade without stalling. Caterpillar executives and engineers in Peoria watched the trucking industry struggle and realized that the brutal, heavy-duty durability they had perfected for bulldozers could be adapted for the highway. In 1960, Caterpillar officially entered the commercial truck engine market with the introduction of the 1673 diesel engine. The 1673 was a turbocharged, six-cylinder diesel producing 220 horsepower. A turbocharger, a device driven by exhaust gases that forces more air into the engine, allowed the 1673 to burn fuel more efficiently and maintain its power at the high altitudes of the American West, where naturally aspirated engines would gasp for air. The 1673 was derived from an earth-moving block, and it brought a distinct philosophy to the highway. An engine should be overbuilt, designed to run at maximum load all day without tearing itself apart. But building a strong engine was only half the battle. Caterpillar faced a massive hurdle that had nothing to do with iron or aluminum. It was a problem of infrastructure. This was the reality of the service network. The dealers, mechanics, parts suppliers, and repair manuals that keep a machine running after the initial purchase. A construction company could wait a day for a mechanic to drive out to a quarry to fix a bulldozer. An independent truck driver broken down in a blizzard on Interstate 80 in Wyoming could not. If a truck was not moving, it was losing money. To convince fleet owners and independent owner-operators to trust a yellow block, Caterpillar had to build a dedicated truck service network from the ground up. They had to train thousands of mechanics to understand their specific fuel systems and engine architectures. They had to stock parts counters in truck stops and dealerships from coast to coast. They had to prove that a company famous for dirt could survive on the asphalt. The breakthrough in gaining the respect of the American owner-operator arrived in the late 1960s with the introduction of the legendary 1693 diesel engine. If the 1673 was Caterpillar's foot in the door, the 1693 was the engine that kicked the door off its hinges. The 1693 was an absolute monster of a machine. It featured a complex dual overhead cam design, an engine layout where two camshafts are located above the combustion chambers to control the valves, which was incredibly rare and highly advanced for heavy-duty truck diesels of that era. Because of the tall valve cover required to house the overhead cams, truck drivers quickly nicknamed it the cat with a hat. It was heavy, tipping the scales at over 3,000 pounds. It was expensive to buy and complex to repair, but for the truck driver it offered something intoxicating: 425 horsepower of relentless hill-leveling strength. In an era when most truck engines were struggling to break 300 horsepower, a Kenworth or Peterbilt equipped with a 1693 could fly past other trucks on steep mountain passes. The 1693 established a cultural baseline for Caterpillar in the American trucking industry. It cemented the yellow engine block as a premium option, a status symbol for the independent driver who owned his own truck and wanted the biggest, baddest piece of iron on the road. The sound of a 1693 with its distinct turbo whine and deep mechanical exhaust note became a recognizable part of the American highway soundtrack. By the early 1970s, Caterpillar had proven that its engines could survive the relentless miles of the interstate. Truck manufacturers were proudly listing Cat engines in their factory brochures. The service network had expanded to meet the drivers where they worked. The foundation of a massive industrial empire had been laid across the nation's truck stops and freight lanes. The iron was strong enough for the dirt, and the company had successfully learned the brutal economics of moving highway freight. But to truly rule the American road, Caterpillar needed an engine that would not just participate in the market, but dominate it. And they were about to cast the block that would change the industry forever. The 1693 had proved Caterpillar could survive the brutal realities of the highway, but it was massive, expensive, and complex. To truly dominate the American freight lanes, Peoria needed an engine that was simpler, universally adaptable, and virtually impossible to kill. In 1973, they cast the block that would define their legacy and reshape the trucking industry: the 3406. The 3406 was a straight six, a six-cylinder engine arranged in one continuous line, a layout that provides natural mechanical balance and immense low-end pulling power. It was fundamentally perfect for the long, narrow frame rails of an American conventional truck like a Kenworth W900 or a Peterbilt 359. Displacing 14.6 liters, it was physically imposing, yet compared to earlier overhead cam experiments, it was incredibly straightforward for a mechanic to service. Through the late 1970s and the roaring freight days of the 1980s, the engine evolved into the 3406B model. This specific piece of iron became the undisputed king of the independent owner-operator. It utilized a mechanical fuel pump that delivered diesel with brutal, reliable consistency. In a diesel engine, an internal combustion engine that ignites fuel purely by compressing air until it becomes hot enough to burn, precise fuel delivery is everything. The 3406B relied on a mechanical injection system, meaning there were no computers, no sensors, and very few delicate wires to fail. It was an engine of pure physical geometry. In a dusty truck stop in Texas or a dimly lit repair bay in Ohio, a mechanic could diagnose a 3406B with a wrench, a keen ear, and basic hand tools. Truck drivers learned to trust its deep, rhythmic, heavy-breathing idle. Fleet managers loved it because a driver could accidentally abuse it, run it hot pulling maximum weight across the Mojave Desert, and the massive iron block would simply refuse to warp or crack. It was not uncommon for a well-maintained 3406B to run over 500,000 miles before requiring an overhaul, a major service process where an engine is taken apart, inspected, and rebuilt with new internal parts to start a second life on the road. But as the 1980s closed, the world around the mechanical engine began to shift. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, was beginning to tighten emission standards. Rules designed to reduce pollutants and visible smoke from engine exhaust. The sheer volume of black soot that traditionally poured from a diesel stack on a hard acceleration was quickly becoming a legal liability. At the same time, fleet owners were facing volatile fuel prices and demanding better efficiency from their equipment. Mechanical fuel pumps had reached their engineering limit. They could not adjust engine timing and fuel delivery fast enough to burn cleaner without sacrificing the raw torque that drivers demanded. Caterpillar faced a critical decision. They could try to stretch the aging mechanical architecture of the 3406, or they could do something that terrified the average American truck driver. They could put a computer on the block. In 1993, Caterpillar released the 3406E. The E stood for electronic. This was a massive cultural and mechanical breakthrough. The 3406E introduced advanced electronic fuel injection, a system that sprayed fuel into the engine much more precisely than a mechanical pump, controlled entirely by an electronic control module, or ECM. Instead of a physical steel linkage telling the fuel pump how much diesel to send, a sensor read the position of the driver's throttle pedal, sent a digital signal to the computer, and the computer calculated the exact microsecond to fire the injectors. Initially, the American trucking industry was highly suspicious, and for good reason. A truck driver could fix a broken mechanical linkage on the side of a frozen highway in Montana with a piece of wire and a pair of pliers. You could not fix a dead computer circuit board in a blizzard. Mechanics in small-town garages stared at the ECMs mounted on the side of the yellow blocks and wondered if their trade was being taken over by software engineers. The parts counter shifted from selling just gaskets and springs to stocking wire harnesses and sensors. But Caterpillar had done its homework. The 3406E was rigorously tested to survive extreme vibration, heat, and cold. More importantly, it offered a level of drivability that mechanical engines simply could not match. The computer could adjust the engine's timing thousands of times a minute. It could optimize fuel delivery based on air temperature, altitude, and the exact weight of the load. The result on the highway was a revelation. A driver hauling 80,000 pounds of timber out of the Pacific Northwest could put their foot down on a steep grade, and the 3406E would deliver a wave of smooth, uninterrupted torque without the massive plumes of wasted black smoke. It ran cleaner, it used less fuel, and most importantly to the owner-operator, it pulled harder than almost anything else on the interstate. The 3400E could be factory programmed to deliver up to 550 horsepower, a staggering figure for a factory highway truck in the 1990s. Caterpillar had successfully bridged the gap between raw iron durability and digital precision. They had convinced the most skeptical, independent workforce in America to trust a microchip. The service network adapted seamlessly. Mechanics learned to plug diagnostic laptops into the dashboard instead of just turning a wrench, and the yellow engine block achieved an almost mythical status in American freight culture. By the late 1990s, if a driver pulled into a fuel island with a 3406E rumbling under a long hood Peterbilt, they commanded immediate respect. The engine was the gold standard. The block was indestructible, the electronics were dialed in, and the industry had not yet seen the true price of keeping the exhaust clean. By the turn of the millennium, Caterpillar did not just participate in the American highway market. They owned its culture. The evolution of the electronic 3406 culminated in 1999 with the introduction of the C15, specifically the iteration known by its legendary serial number prefix, the 6NZ. For the American owner-operator, the 6NZ was not just a piece of machinery, it was the absolute pinnacle of heavy-duty diesel architecture. To understand the scale of Caterpillar's glory, you have to look at the American truck stop at the height of the long hood era. If you walk through the sprawling parking lots of the Iowa 80 truck stop or a crowded Flying J in West Texas in the early 2000s, the visual hierarchy was clear. The undisputed kings of the asphalt were the classic conventional trucks, the Peterbilt 379, the Kenworth W900L, and the Freightliner Classic. These were massive, square-jawed machines built for independent drivers who owned their equipment and hauled freight from coast to coast. And under the hoods of the most respected trucks on the lot, the block was almost always yellow. The C15 displaced 15.2 liters. It was a massive straight six that could easily be ordered from the factory with up to 600 horsepower and 2,050 pound-feet of torque. Torque, the twisting force that a driver feels as raw pulling strength, was the currency of the mountains. When a driver hauling a flatbed loaded with 80,000 pounds of steel coil hit the steep grades of Donner Pass in California, horsepower determined how fast they could go, but torque determined if they made it to the top without dropping too many gears. The C-15 pulled with a smooth, relentless force that competitors simply struggled to match. In an America where a truck engine decided whether a fleet survived the winter, a driver made it over the Rockies, and freight arrived on time. Power was not an abstraction. It was iron, fuel, labor, heat, the smell of diesel, and trust in a yellow block. That trust was measured in a very specific industry metric, the million-mile rebuild. In the commercial freight system, an engine is a capital investment. The C-15 was engineered with robust internal components designed to withstand continuous highway abuse. It was entirely common for a well-maintained 6NZ to cross 1 million miles on the original factory assembly before requiring an overhaul. Mechanics in rebuild shops from Georgia to Oregon respected the architecture because when it was finally time to pull the cylinder head, the heavy cast iron cap that seals the top of the cylinders, the massive block underneath was usually perfectly intact and ready for a second life. Caterpillar's dominance was not just emotional, it was backed by a sprawling industrial network. They had secured massive fleet orders across North America. The service network, the thousands of authorized mechanics, dealers, and parts counters, was so vast that a driver knew they could get a replacement sensor or a water pump anywhere from the rural stretches of the Midwest to the busy ports of the East Coast. The 6NZ C-15 became the gold standard of American freight because it represented the perfect balance of two eras. It had the unbreakable cast iron brawn of the old mechanical days, perfectly married to the clean, efficient precision of modern fuel injection. The sound of the C-15 was distinct, a deep, resonant hum that lacked the aggressive mechanical clatter of older engines, yet signaled immense controlled power. It did not leak. It did not overheat. It simply worked, day after day, burning diesel and turning it into revenue. Caterpillar had perfected the internal combustion engine for the American highway, but the rules of combustion were about to be rewritten. To truly grasp the scale of Caterpillar's empire at its peak, you have to look under the long, fiberglass hood of a Peterbilt 379. When a driver unlatched the rubber tie-downs and tilted that massive hood forward, the engine bay was entirely dominated by the color yellow. The C-15 was a towering piece of cast iron, weighing nearly 3,000 pounds, sitting squarely between the steel frame rails. It looked less like a component of a vehicle and more like a stationary industrial powerhouse that had been bolted to a set of wheels. For the American owner-operator, this block was a fortress. The secret to its legendary durability lay in its internal architecture. The C-15 was a wet-sleeve engine, an engine design where the cylinder walls are not bored directly into the permanent iron block, but are instead heavy, removable steel tubes surrounded by liquid coolant. This design completely changed the economics of American trucking. When a conventional engine wore out, the entire block usually had to be removed from the truck, stripped down, and sent to a machine shop to be bored out, a process that could keep a driver off the road for weeks. But with the C-15, a mechanic at a repair shop in Missouri or Ohio could perform an in-frame overhaul. An in-frame overhaul is a massive service procedure where the engine block remains firmly bolted to the truck chassis while mechanics pull out the old pistons, slide out the worn cylinder sleeves, drop in brand new ones, and bolt the heavy cylinder head back on. This was the ultimate object in system perfection. A fleet owner could route a truck with 1 million miles on the odometer into a service bay on a Friday morning, and by Monday afternoon, the mechanic would turn the key, the yellow block would fire up with fresh compression, and the truck would be ready to haul freight for another 1 million miles. The engine was not meant to be thrown away, it was meant to be sustained. This mechanical reliability created a fanatical cultural following. By the early 2000s, Caterpillar was no longer just an equipment manufacturer. It was a lifestyle brand for the American highway. Independent drivers bolted chrome cat emblems to their grills. They installed yellow cat mud flaps that dragged against the asphalt. They wore the iconic black and yellow hats at the fuel islands. In a highly fragmented industry where a single breakdown could cost an independent trucker their business, the yellow paint represented financial security. A driver hauling refrigerated produce, where a delay of a few hours could ruin a load of California strawberries before they reached a supermarket in New York, did not want a cheap engine. They wanted the heaviest, most overbuilt block they could finance. They wanted the deep, rhythmic, heavy-breathing sound of a 6NZ echoing off the concrete barriers of Interstate 80. The performance on the road matched the physical presence. Inside the cab, drivers monitored the engine's health through analog gauges set in wood-grain dashboards. The most important was the pyrometer, a gauge that measures the exact temperature of the exhaust gases exiting the engine. When an American truck driver hit the steep 6% grades of the Appalachian Mountains with a heavy flatbed trailer, they would watch the pyrometer needle climb as the engine worked harder, generating massive heat to produce torque. The brilliance of the 6NZ was that it could endure that blistering heat, pulling at maximum load, hour after hour, without melting a piston or warping the cylinder head. It was a machine that absorbed abuse and translated it into forward motion. Behind this iron was an unparalleled industrial service network. Caterpillar had built a fortress of support across the North American continent. If a water pump failed in the rural high desert of Nevada, or an alternator bracket cracked in the freezing winter of North Dakota, a driver was rarely more than a tow truck ride away from an authorized Cat dealership. The parts counters were stocked. The mechanics were factory trained. The diagnostic software was standardized. The company had mastered not only the physics of internal combustion, but the sprawling, complex logistics of keeping the American freight system moving. By 2002, Caterpillar commanded a massive share of the premium heavy-duty truck market. They had successfully navigated the transition from pure mechanics to digital fuel injection. They had earned the absolute loyalty of the most demanding drivers in the world. They had proven that an earth-moving company could conquer the asphalt. Caterpillar had built the perfect highway machine. The tragedy was that the American highway was about to become an environmental battleground. The collapse of an American engine empire rarely begins with a factory shutting its doors or a sudden bankruptcy. It usually begins with a small crack in the foundation, a slight shift in the rules that makes the old way of doing things impossible. For Caterpillar's on-highway truck engines, that first crack appeared in the late 1990s and became a physical reality in October 2002. The Environmental Protection Agency, pushing aggressively to clean up the American freight industry, had accelerated its timeline for new emission standards. Heavy-duty diesel manufacturers were forced to meet strict new limits on nitrogen oxide NOx emissions by October 2002, earlier than originally planned. The industry was caught off guard, and Caterpillar needed an immediate solution to keep selling engines while they developed a long-term fix. Their answer was the C15 bridge engine, heavily recognized by mechanics and drivers by its serial number prefix, the MBN. On paper, the MBN was supposed to be a continuation of the legendary 6NZ block, tweaked to satisfy the regulators. In reality, on the American highway, it became the first major blow to Caterpillar's reputation. To meet the emissions targets without a completely new engine architecture, engineers altered the injection timing and restricted the exhaust flow to trap heat and burn off pollutants. The physical consequence of this engineering compromise was severe. The MBN engines ran incredibly hot. An independent truck driver hauling a heavy load of steel up the steep grades of Interstate 80 in Pennsylvania would watch their pyrometer climb to alarming temperatures. To keep the engine from melting down, the computer would automatically derate the power, forcing the truck to slow down. Worse than the heat was the fuel economy. A fleet that was used to getting well over 6 miles to the gallon with older C15s suddenly saw their new MBN-equipped trucks struggling to break 5 miles to the gallon. In the highly leveraged world of American trucking, fuel is often the highest operating expense. An engine that burned more fuel to do the same amount of work was not just an annoyance, it was a threat to a fleet's survival. Drivers began to complain. Mechanics started looking for ways to bypass the factory software. The absolute, unquestioned trust that owner-operators had placed in the yellow engine block began to fracture. The problem was not that Caterpillar forgot how to build a strong cast iron block. The problem was that the federal rulebook had changed the fundamental design problem of the diesel engine. The goal was no longer just maximum torque and maximum reliability. The new goal was chemical compliance. Knowing the MBN was only a temporary patch, Caterpillar faced a massive strategic decision for the next round of regulations. Across the industry, most of their major competitors, including Cummins and Detroit Diesel, were adopting EGR, exhaust gas recirculation. EGR is a system that routes a portion of the hot, oxygen-depleted exhaust gases back into the engine's air intake. This lowers the combustion temperature and effectively reduces nitrogen oxide emissions. But Caterpillar's engineers in Peoria refused to use EGR. To a company built on absolute mechanical durability, the idea of taking dirty, soot-filled exhaust gas and pumping it back into the clean cylinders of an engine was engineering heresy. They believed it would create massive abrasive wear on the cylinder walls, destroy the engine oil, and ruin the million-mile reliability their customers demanded. Instead, Caterpillar made a massive, billion-dollar gamble on an entirely different technology. They called it ACERT, Advanced Combustion Emissions Reduction Technology. Introduced to the highway market in 2003 and 2004, the ACERT C15 was an incredibly complex piece of machinery. Instead of recirculating exhaust gas, ACERT was a system that used advanced air management, precise electronic valve timing, and multiple turbochargers to force massive amounts of clean, cool air into the cylinders to control the combustion temperature. When a driver opened the hood of a new Peterbilt equipped with an ACERT C15, the engine bay looked entirely different. Instead of a single, simple turbocharger mounted on the side of the yellow block, there were two massive turbochargers bolted together in a compound arrangement. The engine was heavier. It required complex software to orchestrate the air and fuel delivery. Initially, ACERT seemed like a brilliant, defiant victory. Caterpillar had met the emissions standards without resorting to EGR. The twin-turbo C15 ACERT engines produced massive amounts of power, and drivers loved the smooth, relentless torque they delivered on the highway. But the complexity came at a cost. The twin turbos generated intense underhood heat, stressing belts, hoses, and cooling systems. The engines were expensive to build and expensive to repair. In a rural machine shop, a mechanic could no longer just swap a single turbo in an afternoon. They had to navigate a complicated array of high-pressure airlines and dual housings. The company had successfully defended its engineering pride, and the yellow engines continued to dominate the long-hood truck market through the mid-2000s. But the ACERT system was pushing the limits of what a diesel engine could do with air and fuel alone. Caterpillar had survived the first round of the emissions war, but the EPA was already writing the rules for 2007, and the exhaust was about to get much more expensive to clean. By 2007, the EPA did not just want to reduce invisible nitrogen oxides, they wanted to eliminate the black soot completely. To meet the aggressive 2007 standard, heavy-duty engine manufacturers had to introduce the diesel particulate filter, or DPF. A DPF is a massive ceramic honeycomb device placed in the exhaust stream that physically traps soot, and then periodically uses intense heat to bake that soot into a fine ash, a process called regeneration. For Caterpillar, bolting a DPF onto the already incredibly hot and complex twin-turbo ACERT system was an engineering nightmare. The iconic clean look of a long-hood Peterbilt 379 with dual chrome exhaust stacks was suddenly burdened with massive exhaust canisters underneath the cab that looked like small water heaters. For the American truck driver, the daily experience of hauling freight changed almost overnight. Drivers who were used to running 1,000,000 miles without ever thinking about their exhaust suddenly found themselves staring at glowing warning lights on the dashboard. When the DPF filled with soot, the engine would force an active regen, injecting raw diesel fuel directly into the exhaust stream to raise the temperatures to well over 1,000 degrees to burn the filter clean. If a truck was pulling a heavy load up a mountain, the exhaust was naturally hot enough to burn the soot. But if a driver was stuck in stop-and-go traffic in Chicago or idling in a freezing truck stop in North Dakota, the filter would clog rapidly. If the regeneration system failed, the computer would automatically derate the engine, forcing a truck loaded with 80,000 pounds of freight to crawl on the shoulder of the highway at 5 miles an hour to protect the emission system. The yellow engine block was no longer just a machine for pulling freight. It had been forced to carry a rolling chemical plant on its back. The legendary reliability that had defined the 3406 and the early C-15 began to collapse entirely under the weight of emissions-related warranty claims. Mechanics in authorized Caterpillar repair shops spent less time rebuilding the strong cast-iron blocks and more time chasing electrical gremlins, replacing melted wiring harnesses, swapping out clogged pressure sensors, and diagnosing failed exhaust filters. The iron at the center of the engine was still practically indestructible, but the complex system required to keep it legal was constantly breaking, and the final blow was already on the horizon. The EPA had mandated even stricter rules for 2010, which would require the entire trucking industry to adopt selective catalytic reduction, or SCR. This system required the use of DF, diesel exhaust fluid, a chemical urea mixture that had to be injected into the exhaust stream from a separate tank on the truck to neutralize emissions. Caterpillar executives in Peoria looked at the brutal reality of the American highway market. They looked at the massive, bleeding warranty costs of their 2007 ACERT engines. They looked at the billions of dollars that would be required to develop a brand new SCR system for 2010. And they looked at their core business, the massive off-highway earth-moving and mining equipment that did not yet face the same immediate, suffocating highway regulations. The math no longer made sense. The cost of keeping the yellow block on the asphalt had finally exceeded the value of the freight it pulled. In June 2008, Caterpillar issued a press release that sent a shockwave through every truck stop, dealership, and fleet maintenance shop in America. They announced they would not build an engine to meet the EPA 2010 standards. After a half-century of dominance, they were exiting the North American heavy-duty on-highway truck market entirely. The engine still ran. The orders slowed. The rulebook changed. The parts got harder to find. The factory line moved. The sound faded. The badge remained. The world it powered was gone. Caterpillar's 2008 decision to abandon the North American commercial highway market was absolute. The company itself did not collapse. They simply retreated to the dirt. They refocused their immense engineering resources on the off-highway earth-moving, mining, and industrial equipment that had made them a global superpower in the first place. The yellow iron continued to dig quarries, power massive generators, and move mountains. But on the asphalt, the era of factory new Cat truck engines was officially over. But an American engine empire does not vanish just because a boardroom issues a press release. The massive C-15 blocks that had been sold by the hundreds of thousands over the previous decades were still out there, bolted to frame rails, running freight. And almost immediately after Caterpillar's exit, a massive underground economy ignited to keep those pre-emissions blocks alive. The American trucking industry found a legal loophole to hold on to the past. It was called the glider kit. A glider kit is a brand new truck chassis, complete with a fresh cab, modern wiring, and a pristine interior, shipped from a manufacturer like Peterbilt or Kenworth without an engine or a transmission. Independent owner-operators and small fleets bought these gliders specifically so they could take a legendary pre-emissions Caterpillar C-15, usually a revered 6NZ, rebuild it from the bare block up and drop it into the new truck. This was not just a cost-saving measure, it was a mechanical rebellion. Drivers were willing to pay a massive premium to drive a brand new truck powered by a decade-old engine architecture. They wanted the deep, rhythmic exhaust note. They wanted the massive, reliable torque that did not require a computer to constantly monitor a diesel particulate filter. They wanted to turn a key without worrying if a faulty sensor in the exhaust pipe was going to force the engine to derate and strand them on the side of a frozen highway. For years, the glider kit industry boomed, sustaining a massive network of specialized American machine shops. Across the Midwest in rural repair bays and in large diesel remanufacturing facilities, mechanics made a lucrative living entirely dedicated to the preservation of the yellow block. They mastered the art of the in-frame overhaul. They hoarded spare cylinder heads, polished crankshafts, and memorized the part numbers of the mechanical components that had once defined American highway reliability. They kept the iconic sound alive, especially the deafening, thunderous roar of the engine's compression release brake, the Jake brake, echoing off mountain passes. Eventually, the federal government closed the glider kit loophole, heavily restricting the practice. Caterpillar itself made a brief, half-hearted attempt to re-enter the vocational truck market years later with a vehicle called the CT-60, but the engine under the hood was essentially a rebranded Navistar block painted yellow. The American truck driver, notoriously loyal but acutely aware of authenticity, largely rejected it. The true Caterpillar highway empire was already sealed in the past. Today, the legacy of the yellow diesel is fiercely guarded by an enthusiast and preservation community. At truck shows across the country, from the Walcott Truckers Jamboree in Iowa to the Mid-America Trucking Show in Kentucky, the most revered machines on the lot are the immaculately restored long-hood conventional trucks, hiding rebuilt mechanical 3406s or early electronic C15s under their custom fiberglass. This preservation is not merely nostalgia. A heavily modified million-mile Caterpillar block, still pulling a loaded flatbed down an interstate, is a physical argument about a vanished era of industrial design. It represents a time when an American machine was built to outlast the market that created it. The yellow block is a monument to the idea that power should be sustained through heavy iron and skilled labor, rather than treated as a disposable component managed by software and sealed emission systems. It proves that there was a brief, perfect window where mechanical durability and digital fuel injection met, right before the exhaust pipe became more complicated than the cylinders themselves. The transition to modern emissions-compliant diesel engines was a regulatory reality, but in that transition, the fundamental relationship between the driver and the machine was permanently altered. The American truck driver went from being the master of a mechanical beast to the operator of a highly regulated chemical processor. The trust moved from the iron to the software. Somewhere in a dimly lit repair bay off Interstate 80, a worn Caterpillar C15 sits securely bolted to a heavy steel engine stand. Its yellow paint is faded, stained with oil and road grime from a million miles of hauling freight. A mechanic wipes his hands on a shop rag, looking over the massive cast iron cylinder head, preparing to drop in a fresh set of steel sleeves. The block is ready for its next life, waiting to return to a highway that no longer sounds the same. See you in the next one.